Thank you very much for the invitation. I really appreciate it. And as they've said, some of you may have had the opportunity to have a look at the paper that we put together that came out towards the end of last year. But for those of you who haven't, and also for those of you who have, hopefully what I can provide today is a bit more detail and I guess a bit more intelligence that we've gathered since. We've been very aware for a number of years of the importance of integrated care, and it's a lot of what we do and focus on a lot of examples of care coordination and how that's working on the ground. But what we've come to realize over the past couple of years, I guess, is that a lot of areas feel like they've come to the limits of what they're able to do through just wanting to work together, or goodwill, or pre-existing relationships, and wanted something a little bit more formal in place to support them to work together and achieve better outcomes for patients. So we knew there was a lot of talk about accountable care organisations and different contracting models, so really set about trying to understand that world in a bit more detail. So the context that we were really looking at was providers who were interested in both quality improvement and cost containment. Yeah, I don't need to tell you about the significant financial challenges that the entire system's facing, the demographic situation that we're in, aging population, increasing comorbidities, etc. But what we did understand was that there were perhaps limitations to informal collaboration, and particularly that was being felt for patients as they fell through the gaps between some of these services. So on this basis, we knew that there perhaps was some barriers to what people really felt they were able to achieve, particularly around payment system, and I've written here payment system, but it really is plural, that different providers are paid in different ways, and different bodies hold the purses by which they're paid, etc. But also that there's huge information governance issues about what can and can't be shared. And for some providers who had all the willing in the world to work together, some of these things were insurmountable, or they were actually standing in the way of delivering integrated patient care on a day-to-day basis. So for this reason, we did start to look at new contracting models. I returned to the King's Fund after a leave of absence, during which I was in the US looking at accountable care organisations. I'm not going to go into any detail specifically about them in this presentation, but happy to answer any questions. But I came back 2 years ago now, at a time where there was a lot of chat about ACOs as a potential model for organising and delivering more integrated care. But also at the same time, a lot of discussion around prime provider, prime contractor, lead provider models, and alliance contracting as well. They all look largely different, and I'll talk in a bit more detail about how we've described them at least. But in essence, all of the things that we were looking at were all contracting models that were trying to stimulate more integrated delivery of care. Initially, we thought, well, this might be quite easy. What we want to put together is a bit of a matrix or a typology of different very specific contracting types and the conditions under which you might choose one or another. It very quickly became apparent that that isn't useful or practical or helpful in any way, or actually even possible, that when we went out and tried to find some areas that were developing new contracting models for integrated care, we were very struck by different areas using the same words to describe different approaches, or different words to describe the same approach. So what we really wanted to do was try and, I guess, cut through some of that and really think about what are the broad, different contractual approaches that are being used in this area. So let me just explain a little bit more about where we went and why before I get into the specific models. And this is all detailed in our report. If you want any more information on any of these sites, then do have a look in the report, and that has a bit more detail about what they've done and why. But in essence, one of the first things I did when I went to each of these sites was to really try and understand what the problem was that they were trying to solve. And there were some commonalities across all of these areas. Essentially, there were problems with access, there were problems with patient outcomes, there was problems with patient experience. Not all of the sites were necessarily trying to save money, but for all of the sites, these represented high-cost areas and were therefore worthy of further scrutiny to understand whether efficiencies could be made in any way. Some of these, and I'll come back to this in a little while, but these are quite different than ACO-like models that you might see in the US, predominantly because they are typically based in a specific area. So you'll see that the Staffordshire example, which I'm sure anybody who's been reading the HSJ recently will be well aware of, is focused specifically on cancer and end-of-life care. The Bedfordshire example, which is perhaps the most furthest along the track and maybe the most well-known, is very much focused on musculoskeletal care, compared to accountable care organisation models, which are responsible and accountable for a whole population of care. So what we were working with here was quite a different structure. Also, that what you'll notice from this diagram here is the length of the contract, and this is quite different compared to traditional contracting in the NHS. Staffordshire represents probably the longest contract period with 10 years, but all of these are multi-year contracts, mostly to allow that space for providers to actually really think about how they're delivering services within that contract and feeling secure in making necessary investments up front to redesign systems and processes to actually achieve the outcomes that they want to achieve. So now just to describe, I guess, what we've boiled down to three overarching contract types. And you'll see here that I've tried to really describe the 5 sites that we were working with within this framework. But I'll use the framework to draw out some of the details a bit more. The first is what we've called a prime contractor model. You might also hear this referred to as a lead provider or a prime provider, but there's a distinction that I think is really clear in this model, and that is that prime body, whatever you decide to call it, isn't actually responsible for delivering services. So what the commissioner, typically a CCG, but could be a pooled budget arrangement, what the commissioner does is contracts with a single organisation or a consortia who then takes responsibility for the day-to-day management of other providers within the contracted scope or pathway. So the commissioner would typically hand over the budget for that particular area. So this example that we're talking about here can be seen in the MSK model in Bedfordshire, where they've appointed Circle as the prime contractor. So the commissioner establishes how much they actually spend on MSK services, and in some instances how much they want to spend on it, either more or less, typically less I would imagine, hand over that entire budget to the prime contractor. That prime contractor, who kind of acts as an integrator, is then responsible for managing the supply chain through individual subcontracts with other providers who will then deliver the specific contracted service. So in and of itself, this isn't stimulating more integrated care. It's up to that integrator to try and make that happen through those subcontracts. So from the commissioner's perspective, they remove that specific element of the NHS standard contract out of their contracts with all of those providers. So they strip out any reference to MSK from their contract, and that would go into the subcontracts between the integrator and each of these providers. So one of the upsides of this is that, in theory at least, this is quite simple for commissioners to manage. They now have one contract for MSK services or whatever it is that you're contracting for, rather than the 25 or 30 contracts that you might have had. But the downside might be, how much control does that prime contractor or integrator have over the actual delivery of services? And again, if you've been looking at HSJ recently, you might have seen that Circle in Bedfordshire is actually struggling to try and establish some of those subcontracts on the ground. So this might represent a problem with this type of model. So to overcome that, some areas are thinking, well, actually, we don't want to introduce another player, Circle or whoever, into the local health economy. What we want is for an existing provider to take on that supply chain management or integrator role as well. If the current provider, or if the commissioners feel that the current provider mix isn't capable of taking on that function, they might go out to tender, and we'll come back to this in a moment. But essentially, this approach is about looking at the way care is delivered as well as how that supply chain is actually managed. And the idea is that a prime provider would have more control over building a service that delivers care to meet the contract specification. So they have a vested interest. They deliver care, and where they can't deliver that care themselves, they'll buy it from other providers within that supply chain. So this example can be seen in the case studies in the report in Cambridgeshire, then the prime provider model that they've put together for their older people's program, which has just recently been awarded to a local consortia there. The next model that we looked at or described was quite different. And this is probably the closest thing that we've got to an accountable care organisation here in England. And the key distinction is that there is no formal supply chain in the way that there was in the other two models, but the commissioners and providers share responsibility within an alliance agreement. They share risk and responsibilities for meeting the terms of a single contract. So through that contract, they're all held to account collectively. There's no subcontractual arrangements, there's no prime contractor, there's no integrator. They're all in it together. Everyone's an equal partner, and therefore must instead rely on internal governance structures and leadership arrangements to manage their relationships and delivery of care. So these that are at a much earlier stage of development, there are some that are starting to get up and running. It's quite an attractive model in principle. There's a lot of people talking about this. It does carry quite strong incentives to collaborate and potentially limits the dominance of a single provider. However, this issue of shared accountability is quite complex and quite risky, particularly in areas where there might be fledgling relationships or poor relationships, and because of that complexity, it requires quite high trust. And if you don't have that high trust or those pre-existing relationships, there's a lot of concern about whether this model would actually work in practice. From the examples that we've seen, this model seems to be developing in areas where there are already quite good relationships, but they want something formal that wraps around them. So the examples in the case studies we looked at were Lambeth mental health services, or mental health rehabilitation services to be specific, had developed an alliance contract model, but these people and these providers have been working together for quite a number of years. And similarly in Salford, where they'd put together, or they're in the process of putting together, an alliance contract for how they organise and deliver older people's services. Similarly in Salford, they've got quite a long history of partnership working. Salford's probably an interesting example in another respect as well, and might be worthy of looking at in more detail, in that that model was very much led by Salford Royal, so the provider side rather than the commissioner side. When we did all this work and that we put these models together and felt much clearer about what we were describing, the concern, however, was that a lot of commissioners were getting too caught up in these named models and the contracts, and sometimes forgetting what they were actually trying to achieve, which was essentially more integrated and coordinated care. And in looking at these structures themselves, they're very sort of pretty, and they've got arrows, and they show the reporting and accountability and relationships between all of these parties. However, in and of themselves, they're not going to stimulate more integrated delivery of care on the ground. And we would argue instead that it's the terms of these contracts that are much more important to really stimulate the types of changes that we knew that providers and commissioners were wanting to achieve, or what we've kind of referred to as the underlying principles of the model. So essentially, based on what providers and commissioners were trying to do and what we really saw as the fundamentals of these new organisational models, we sort of draw out three main underlying principles of delivering more integrated care through contractual mechanisms. Firstly, outcomes. Building outcomes into these contracts is absolutely key for achieving the types of changes that the system needs. Some of these might be direct clinical outcomes, whereas others might focus specifically on incentivising collaboration. And they, as we can see in some of the models that are being developed, they can be weighted, and they can become more ambitious over time. But most importantly, they should be developed in consultation with providers, patients, and wider communities. And this is going to be hugely time-consuming, and there's absolutely no shortcut to doing that. But the outcomes, as they're eventually articulated, should be few and easily described to anybody that you're talking to. And then underlying that, there'll be much more specific measures that can be measured and described in more detail. But essentially, the outcomes go back to what is the problem that you're actually trying to solve in this particular service area. The second principle that we thought was really important was contracting for service integration. So the models that I've described focus very much on high-level organisational integration. And what we'd like to see instead is on top of that is contracts that hold providers to account for streamlining care, working across the gaps and the boundaries, and working together more efficiently and for the benefits of patients. And commissioners can build in partnership with providers, can build in measures and outcomes that achieve this purpose. So outcome measures or process measures that can really only be achieved by that service integration. I mentioned payment systems at the outset, and it's worth coming back to because essentially these models aren't going to be as successful as they can unless there's aligned currencies and aligned payment mechanisms across all of the provider types within this framework. And that might mean pooled budgets. I know there's a lot of appetite and interest in this area. We've got a huge conference here at the King's Fund today just on this issue of a single commissioner or a single budget. But it's virtually impossible at the moment to disinvest or move money across the system. So we do need to really think about how that money flows in the best interest of patients and in the best interests to incentivise providers to all work together in this way. So not only do we have different currencies, we have different purses with local councils paying for some things, public health paying for some things, CCGs for the rest. So we really need commissioner integration as much as we do provider integration. So essentially, it's attention to these principles that we really think will drive more organisational integration in combination with a formalised or named contractual vehicle. I don't want to keep coming back to Bedfordshire, but it's probably the longest running example that we can see in practice. But if you have read anything about that model, you'll know that there are ongoing challenges in getting these things up and running. And in talking to the sites, we spoke a lot about some of the things that they've had to face. And I just wanted to draw some of these things out because they're really important to be aware of these up front. And the first of them is around what I've called political sensitivities, but mainly it relates to procurement rules and the need, or whether there is a need to go out to procurement or not, and whether the procurement process is appropriate for this type of contracting context. It's hugely stressful for areas who are going through procurement. It raises a lot of anxieties, particularly around privatisation of the NHS, and that means they have to focus quite heavily on communicating what they're trying to do, why, how they're doing it, being very transparent and being absolutely rigid about following those procurement rules. So this is quite a challenge for a lot of areas who are trying to do quite large-scale new procurements and contract in different ways. It also involves developing new competencies, both around procurement and also different things as well, supply chain management, both for providers and commissioners as well. This might mean thinking in different ways. All of this means that it takes an incredible amount of time and an incredible amount of resources. It's not a quick win. Contracting isn't going to solve your problems. It's not going to mean as a CCG that suddenly you've got a lot of time because you've outsourced all this contract management. Essentially, there's no shortcuts, but it does mean taking on a whole load new responsibilities and skills and competencies. And this does take money, as I said. In the Cambridgeshire example that I was talking about, they spent something in the region of £1 million just on the process of designing and running this model. But that said, there are sources of support. There's a lot of legal firms and procurement specialists out there. However, my concern is how sustainable this is, whether all of the areas out there who are developing new models can be affording the types of support that they need in these areas. And in some situations, it might be those regions that are most in need of a new model of delivering care who are least able to afford it. So that said, I think there's a lot more that NHS England, commissioning support units, local area teams, Monitor, etc. can do to share knowledge of what's out there, what works, develop some templates, etc. And I think that there is a lot more interest and appetite in doing that, and there's a lot of knowledge that different areas can tap into, but it can always be improved. The other challenge that I just wanted to mention, which I alluded to before, was about scope and boundaries, and perhaps I should have spoken about this earlier, but it's very clear from the examples that we've used that they're very focused on a particular population or disease area, and actually trying to define the scope of who's in and out of that model, what care isn't in the model, and how much that actually costs is quite a challenge. You might think that in a seemingly discrete area like MSK, that might be relatively simple, but it still has quite a lot of challenges, and there's boundary issues of, well, is this an MSK issue or is it not? And now it is, but it might stray into a different area, and who's responsible for paying for that? But when you think it's about some of the other models as well, such as cancer, end-of-life care, actually understanding what the full range of services are, for what time period, when is it end-of-life care, when is it not, and the proportion of a district nurse or somebody's time that actually is allocated to dealing with somebody's cancer versus dealing with their diabetes or anything else that they may have to talk about is quite a challenge. So figuring out how much you actually spend on these services is really tricky. Related to that, I've spoken about payment mechanisms and pooled budgets, etc. So a lot of this, both the contract and the payment mechanism, involves shifting some of that responsibility and risk away from commissioners onto providers. And that can be quite a challenge and quite a source of anxiety for many who haven't been accustomed to working in this way. So again, requires a whole load of new skills to think about in the future. So just finally, to wrap up, and then I'm happy to answer any questions, I wanted to draw out sort of 4 key messages based on the report and based on the conversations that I've been having since. And it's worth noting, I guess it's a bit of a temperature gauge of this topic, just anecdotally, that this report, more than any other report I've written in the nearly 8 years I've been at the King's Fund, this report has generated more interest, more emails, more requests to speak, more requests to speak to journalists, to write things, etc. So we've clearly hit a nerve, if that's the right phrase, in what the appetite is out there for these new contractual models, and I think fit quite neatly in the direction of travel with a 5-year forward view and other ways of thinking about organising and delivering care. So based on that, One of the first things that I asked all of the people that we've been talking to is, what's the key lesson that you'd want to share with other areas who are thinking about developing new contracting mechanisms? And the number one thing they talked about was engagement, and spoke about engagement in the sense of with providers, with patients, with wider communities, that it's vital that all of those involved in the program contribute to the developments and buy into the ambitions of the program. Ultimately, all of these people are the ambassadors for either the success or the failure of different approaches to organising and delivering care. Engagement's not a one-stop process. It's not linear. It's going to be repeated. It's going to go off in tangents that you don't expect, but it's absolutely vital that everybody signed up and agreed with what the problem is you're trying to solve and designing the solution to solve it. The second point I want to make is about the importance of maintaining relationships. And I mean actual relationships. In some situations, you can see that a contractual solution might be being deployed as a means of trying to fix bad relationships. And in the experiences that I've seen, the contract won't create relationships where they don't exist, and it might actually magnify tensions or gaps in services. So these all require quite mature relationships, different ways of working, high trust, and it's important that commissioners and providers focus on nurturing those actual relationships as well as developing the contract that sits alongside them. I've mentioned payment mechanisms. I'll say it again because it's just absolutely fundamental to thinking about organising and contracting for care in different ways. New contractual and organisational approaches really should be accompanied by corresponding change in the way that providers are paid and incentivised. Money needs to flow around the system in sensible ways that supports and not prohibits integration. And there's ways of doing this that don't require, full pooled capitated budgets, etc. That's just far, far too risky and beyond where you are at the moment. But there's steps along the way to align budgets and agree how you're going to spend your money across health and social care or across different commissioners in other ways. And lastly, the point that I wanted to make was about governance. What we've talked about and what a lot of the areas out there are talking about are the contract, and thinking that signing that contract is the end of the process, but in a lot of ways it's actually just the beginning. What's required then is providers to actually work together, and in some situations, depending on the model, work together with the commissioner to deliver care in different ways. So they need to develop a governance structure, a forum for making decisions and holding each other to account and organising themselves to actually deliver on the terms of the contract. Otherwise, the risk is just too great, particularly in an alliance contract where providers are in a single contract together. There really needs to be these structures and processes where they can manage that risk and feel confident that decisions are being taken collaboratively. So hopefully what I've outlined to you is that there are major risks and a lot to think about. It's going to take a lot of time, but there are potential benefits in contracting to stimulate and support integrated approaches to care. The types of approaches I've been talking about will require considerable determination and quite fundamental changes in the way providers are paid, what they do and how they work together. The cost of developing these new approaches can be really high. The process can be difficult and very resource intensive, but I think it's clear from the financial and clinical challenges that we're facing that change on this scale is vital if we're able to develop a service that meets these challenges and needs of the population in the future. So thank you very much. I'll finish there and answer any questions, and then just on my last slide, point you to some resources on our website that can provide a bit more information on any of these topics. Thank you very much.